Hey, what's up, y'all? Welcome to the 8th episode of the Better Leader podcast. Glad you're joining us today. I would encourage you, if you haven't already subscribed to the YouTube channel, go ahead and do that. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, rate and review. I know I would appreciate it for sure, but glad you're here with us today. We're talking about Nick Saban, the S&P 500, and then March Madness. So Nick Saban, the S&P 500, and March Madness. What in the world do these three things have in common? Well, we're going to dive in and see what leadership principles we can learn from these categories. So first up, Nick Saban. If you don't know who Nick Saban is, he is the recently retired Alabama head football coach, arguably the greatest football coach of all time, college football coach of all time, 7 national titles during his tenure. And I think you could look across sports, the spectrum of all sports, and say Nick Saban's in the running for the greatest coach ever. And if you know anything about Nick Saban, you know he is intense. You can often see video of him chewing out an official or a player on the sideline. But the truth is he had a lot of success. And so I think it's important to look at why was he so successful. And if you had the opportunity to listen to any of his leadership content, Nick Saban has a very systematic approach of what he wanted to happen within his program. And he had certain principles that he preached quite often. And one of those was the principle of togetherness. Nick Saban said, if you don't have togetherness as a team, you're not going to be successful. And actually, in a 2016 interview, Nick Saban said one of the things that he feared the most about retiring was not being part of a team any longer. Now, I'm sure in his adventures after retirement, he'll still be part of a team, but that was one of the things that he feared, was not having that togetherness with people. And that togetherness is so important in terms of leading. If the organization you're in, if people don't have a sense of togetherness, other people on the outside are going to see that. Restaurateur Danny Meyer, who is the founder of Shake Shack, I've mentioned him on the podcast before. One of the things he talks about with his Union Square hospitality group is that people notice when they come in. If people aren't enjoying their jobs and there's not a sense of togetherness on the team, the outsiders can see that so clearly. And so we want to strive for a sense of togetherness on our team. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like that you're investing in your people. You know, Danny Meyer also says is that you want to invest in your people actually before your customers. And he says, hey, in hospitality, I was always taught to put the customers first. But he's like, what we do is actually put the customers second. Because if we're not investing in our team, if there's not a sense of togetherness and unity, then people on the outside, we won't be able to care for them well or serve them well. And so Nick Saban was spot on in preaching this idea of togetherness. And recently I had to get some documents processed at a government entity. Sounds like fun out there if you're listening. And as I went through this process, and it's an important thing, and actually it's a thing that actually aids society in a great way and is of value and importance. It adds structure and order to what's going on. But as I visited this place and went through this process, I was kind of overwhelmed at how poorly kept the building was. I was kind of like shocked at the way that it was set up and structured. And there was a lot of people there working, but I noticed it very much felt like a bunch of individuals all performing a task. And as it was early in the morning, one of the people that I spoke to, I could already tell that the day they already had a bad attitude about what was going to happen, and the day had just begun. And I feel a sense of empathy when I meet people in these situations, because I think it so shows the leadership, everything from the way the building looked to the attitude that the workers had. It was a very individualistic setup. They lacked togetherness. And as Nick Saban pointed out, and as he preached to his teams, you have to have a sense of togetherness. There has to be a sense of unity towards a vision, towards a purpose of what's going on. And if you listen to the last episode on teams on the Better Leader podcast, we talked about how important it is to have a unified vision and goal. That's what's going to be the glue of this sense of togetherness, but it's something that we have to strive for. And as our society moves more individualistic, it is something that we have to continuously preach, is this idea of togetherness. And it's so obvious to people outside of your organization, whether you have a sense of togetherness or not. So that is something that a lesson that we can learn from Nick Saban. He has 7 national titles, right? Is there is a value in having a sense of togetherness. Now, the S&P 500, what are we going to talk about with this? I recently read an article from Richard Baker, who is the senior wealth advisor and founder of Fervent Wealth Management. He's a friend of mine, and he puts out these articles and really helps people understand what is going on with the market. And he's wrote an article recently called What We Can Learn from the Recent COVID-19 Pandemic in Terms of the Market, and what are the lessons we can learn from what we just went through with the pandemic. And in this article, one of the things he talked about is there's value in not overreacting. So what did people do whenever the pandemic hit? Is that a lot of people overreacted. And in this article, Richard actually points out that since 1995, if someone was fully invested in the S&P 500, so that's over from 1995 until December of 2023, that's a 29-year period in which some crazy things happened. There was the dot-com bubble, 9/11 happened in the United States, the Great Recession, and the COVID-19 pandemic hit. He said if someone would have stayed fully invested in the S&P 500, they would have had an average growth rate of almost 11%. And this type of return typically doubles an account about every 7 years. And so what was his advice? His advice was, hey, don't overreact. Stay the course. If you have a systematic approach in investing, stay the course, even in tough times. And I think that's great advice. And in terms of the market, yeah, that makes sense. But I also think it makes sense in terms of leadership. Now, there are times as a leader, you're going to have to respond to a situation immediately. But what I have learned as I've gotten older, I think about who I was as a leader when I first started out, 22 to 25, even whenever I was 18 years old coaching for the first time. I just remember that I would very quickly want to respond and react to any situation or any circumstance. I felt like I always had to have an answer, and I would overreact quite often. And what I think I'm learning and trying to implement is I don't want to be somebody who overreacts, because if I overreact, that's not going to create stability in the group of people that I lead or the organization that I'm within. And what I've so often found and what I've learned from the people who are around me, people who are wiser than me, is that when I don't overreact, I actually give time to process through what's happening. And it gives me time to think through different scenarios. There's so many times I feel like I've been protected by not overreacting and by having a team of people around me who together we process through decision and we make a systematic approach and we take in all of the information, all of the details, and then we make a decision. You know, for me, one of the times this was most evident was actually during the pandemic or following the pandemic. You know, within the church setting, people were scrambling. Hey, what is this going to look like? The church is founded on people gathering together. So what are we going to do in response to that? And I think that there were a lot of churches that in businesses and people, they overreacted. Actually, one of my funniest stories during the pandemic is I was selling some camera equipment on behalf of our church, and someone offered to trade us 2 pallets of hand sanitizer for this camera equipment. And it was one of those things, it's like, man, why does this guy have 2 pallets of hand sanitizer? He overreacted, right, to the situation, and then he got himself in something where he couldn't get out of. But I was really proud of the way our team responded in the midst of the pandemic. Where we could have overreacted, we didn't. I remember distinctly going into a room with a group of our leaders, getting out a whiteboard and saying, hey, how are we going to approach this? What are the things that we need to clean up in terms of our online presence in order to make this easy for our people to access? What are the pieces of equipment that we need? And many people bought a lot of things they didn't actually need during the pandemic, or they overspent. I was very proud that we took a very systematic approach and said, what do we need? What are the upgrades we need to put in place? And what are the things that we need to develop in order to effectively respond to the situation? And I think in the outside of that, and I really give credit to God for protecting us and giving us wisdom, I think on the backside of that, we were stronger because of it. And now we have things in place and systems in place in response that still aid us today, even though we rely on them in a different way. And I really feel like, man, if we would have overreacted, that would have been a problem. Now, we don't want to underreact. We didn't underreact and do nothing and just be like, well, this is the worst. What can we do? We appropriately reacted to this situation, just relying on the team and taking a systematic approach to what was going on. And so the same way we can learn from the market, don't overreact in our leadership. Now, the last topic, March Madness. Now, it's April now, but March Madness, the NCAA tournament, and the craziness was upon us for sure. Many of y'all had your brackets busted, I am sure. But what can we learn from March Madness? And what's been so interesting to me as a sports fan, as someone who appreciates this time of year and really enjoys the competitiveness of it, is what we've seen is that there's a lot of teams now in college athletics, specifically in college basketball, that they've had success because they have players who are more seasoned. They're older, players who have stayed in they're in their fourth or fifth year of playing. That's really advantageous around this time of year. Why? They've been in big games before. This might not be the first time they're in the NCAA tournament. They have experience. And also, naturally, their skills have developed. They're physically more mature. You know, if you're 23 years old and in your fifth year of college basketball, you're going to be physically more mature most often than an 18-year-old who's coming in as a freshman. Even though they might have more talent, your skills are more solid, you're more refined. Maybe you're mentally tougher at this point. But we've seen that within sports, these veterans and these veteran presence, we hear about that all the time in any sport, even at the professional level. There's an importance in having a veteran presence to your team. And so what can we learn from that is that there's often wisdom that can be drawn upon from someone who's been there before. There's often wisdom that can be drawn upon from someone who's been there before. There's a reason why people favor often coaches who have coached in the tournament time and time again, because they've been there before. They've experienced it. And I've found in leadership, one of the things that I feel so lucky, so blessed, is I have been around, had the opportunity to be so lucky to be around people who have wisdom beyond my years. They have faced situations that I haven't faced. They've already walked through. If I'm facing something for the first time, these people have already faced it maybe 2, maybe 3 times. They've had conversations. They've adapted to different changes that are going on. And so what do we do? Especially if you're a young leader, what do? You got to have people in your life who are ahead of you. You want to be surrounded by people who are ahead of you. If you're in an organization and it's all young people, that can be a great thing. There's a lot of energy and buzz. But do you have anybody that you're leaning into for wisdom and guidance as well? You know, I think about a situation one time, and this was several years ago within our organization, and it was a situation, it really wasn't even a big deal at all. But as a leader, I kind of wanted to win the situation. I don't know if you've ever been there before. I wanted to win this situation. I wanted what I wanted to happen. And I remember I got a phone call from Pastor Eddie Lyons. He's my boss, my lead pastor. And he said, Logan, you do not want to do this. You are going to blow this situation up if you do this. And it wasn't anything crazy. It wasn't a big deal. But he was just like, hey, you're going to blow this up. It's not worth it. You need to take this approach. And I remember I just disagreed so much in the moment. I was like, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's what we should do. I wanted to win. And that's kind of a side note. As a leader, if there's a situation you really, really want to win, I think you got to stop and ask yourself, especially when it comes to people, why do I want to win this? And what's the point in winning this? And so I submitted to what he said, and I followed his guidance and his wisdom. And now I can say 2 or 3 years removed from that situation, I'm like, wow, I am so glad I didn't do what I wanted to do. I am so glad that I didn't try to win, that instead, in humility, we just kind of approached the situation in a different way. And I look now and I'm like, wow, that saved relationships. It sustained unity of what's going on. And things are even thriving in spite of this small situation that occurred. And I'm like, there was so much wisdom that I received from Pastor Eddie in not blowing the situation up. And I'm thankful that I had him to speak that wisdom into me. And so what does that do? It makes me as a leader, I want to continue to surround myself with people who are smarter than I am, people that have had wisdom and that have gone through situations that I haven't gone through. And so one of the cool things that's happened in leadership for me over the last few years is I've started to notice is I'm now leading people who haven't had as much experience as I have had. And one of the cool things about that is that they can come to me and look to me for wisdom, but also too, in the same way I look to wisdom from people who are above me, I also want to look for wisdom from people who are behind me. That fresh eyes in leadership, whenever someone hasn't been in the situation before, they might see it in a completely different way. And so I have to have the humility as a leader for someone that I'm leading, or maybe I have authority over in a sense, is I want to listen to them. What are they saying? How are they viewing the situation? I can so often think I already know the answer and think I already know the right thing to do. But I need to slow down. I'm preaching to myself here. I need to slow down and listen to the people who are beneath me as well. I want to listen to people who are above me, who have more experience, but people who are behind me that haven't had as much experience as well. A good leader, and I've seen that modeled so often, is people who are ahead, who listen to someone's younger, who's listened to someone with fresh eyes. Man, it brings a new perspective to the table. So I think that there's power in listening. There's power, like what we see in March Madness. The people that have been there before, the development that has happened, listen to those people. But don't be afraid, to listen to someone who is coming in with a new mindset and give them the chance. I think the ultimate key in what we just talked about really is having the humility to listen to people around you and process through decisions, make them with a team. Like Nick Saban said, a sense of togetherness matters so much. Don't overreact in our leadership. In the same way the market, stay the course in your financial investments and view it over the long haul. Do the same in approach of your leadership. And I think we will come out better because of it. And so I hope y'all enjoyed that. Those are 3 things I just took away from those situations. And I think that it helps me to think through, how can I be a better leader, and what can I learn from these different categories, these different ideas that we presented today. So I hope y'all got something out of the episode. If you did, be sure to like it, and we appreciate y'all tuning in. We'll see you next time for another episode of the Better Leader Podcast.